The first thing Adelaide Morgan felt was pain. Not fear, not confusion, just pain. White hot and endless. Her breath came in short gasps. Dirt filled her mouth and blood soaked the torn hem of her dress. The Wyoming sky stretched above her, a hard blue without mercy. She tried to move, but her right thigh screamed back in agony. The deep gash throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat, each pulse sending fresh waves of pain through her body. Adelaide blinked against the harsh sunlight, willing her vision to clear. Her fingers dug into the dry earth beneath her, searching for something, anything to ground her to this world. Not far above, 3 vultures circled in lazy spirals, patient shadows against the cloudless sky. They knew what she knew. Out here, wounded things rarely survive till nightfall. Adelaide reached for a rock near her hand, a pathetic weapon, but instinct demanded she try. Her fingers trembled, too weak to grasp it properly. The simple act nearly drained what little strength remained. She closed her eyes, feeling the heat of the sun against her eyelids. Images flashed behind them, the stagecoach, the sudden appearance of 2 men on the trail, their eyes wild with hunger and whiskey, the driver shouting, the thunder of gunshots, her own body tumbling down the rocky embankment as she leapt from the coach, desperate to escape. Now here she lay, miles from anywhere, the wound in her right thigh swelling and hot to the touch. The edges of the deep laceration had turned an angry purple, dirt and fabric embedded in the torn flesh where she had landed on jagged rocks after leaping from the stagecoach. Infection, setting in fast. Adelaide's lips moved in a silent prayer, not for salvation but for dignity in these final moments. She'd come all this way, carried by dreams of a new beginning, only to die alone under this vast, indifferent sky. The sound came distantly at first, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching from the west. Adelaide's eyes fluttered open. Perhaps it was a hallucination, her mind offering comfort in her final moments. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. Then came the shadow, blocking the punishing sun. A man, dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. Through her haze, Adelaide saw him clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin darkened by years under the open sky. His face bore the heritage of 2 worlds, the high cheekbones and dark eyes of his Crow mother, the strong jawline of his white father. Small scars dotted his weathered face like a constellation of past struggles. His black hair, streaked with the occasional silver strand, was tied back neatly with a leather cord. He knelt beside her, his dark eyes assessing her condition with clinical precision. "Don't move," he said, his voice deep and steady. His hands, rough but surprisingly gentle, moved to examine her wound. Adelaide flinched, instinctively pulling away. "I won't hurt you," he continued, meeting her gaze directly. "But that leg needs attention. Now." "Who?" Adelaide's voice cracked, her throat parched from hours under the sun. "Nathaniel Redfeather," he replied simply, already reaching for a canteen at his hip. "The person who's going to help you live through the night." He tilted the canteen to her lips. The water was warm but felt like heaven against her parched throat. She drank greedily until he pulled it away. "Slowly," he cautioned. "Too much at once will make you sick." Nathaniel turned his attention to her right thigh. His expression darkened as he examined the deep laceration. "Infections spreading fast," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "We need to clean this now." Adelaide watched as he retrieved various items from his saddlebags, a small leather pouch, a bottle of amber liquid, clean cloths. His movements were practiced, efficient. This wasn't the first time he'd treated such a wound. "Are you a doctor?" she managed to ask. A shadow passed across his face. "No," he replied after a moment, "just someone who's seen too many wounds." As he cleaned the area around the gash, Adelaide's mind drifted back to Boston, to the decision that had brought her here. The letter of appointment to teach at Sweetwater Junction, a tiny settlement near South Pass City. The promise of a new beginning, far from the ashes of her past. She'd left everything behind, the charred remains of the library, the pitying glances of neighbors, the weight of responsibility that threatened to crush her. She would build something new here in the West, a small school with a library of its own, where children could discover worlds beyond the harsh reality of frontier life. Now, as she lay bleeding into Wyoming soil, Those dreams seemed like childish fantasies. Nathaniel's voice pulled her back to the present. "This will hurt," he warned, holding up the bottle of whiskey, "but it needs to be done." Adelaide nodded, bracing herself. The liquor hit the open wound like liquid fire, and she couldn't suppress the cry that tore from her throat. Her vision swam, darkness threatening at the edges. "Breathe," Nathaniel instructed, his voice calm but firm. "Just breathe." Through the pain, she noticed something unusual about Nathaniel's method of treatment. He mixed Western medicine, the whiskey for disinfection, with what appeared to be native remedies. From the leather pouch, he extracted dried herbs, crushing them between his fingers before applying them to the cleaned wound. "What is that?" she asked, teeth still clenched against the lingering pain. "Yarrow and echinacea," he replied, "to fight the infection and help the body heal itself." He worked in silence for several minutes, bandaging the wound with practiced efficiency. Adelaide studied his hands, strong and calloused, but moving with the precision of a craftsman. "How do you know these things?" and she asked. Nathaniel's eyes flicked briefly to her face. "I learn from those willing to teach," he said simply, "both the living and those no longer here." By the time he finished, the sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in hues of orange and gold. The temperature dropped rapidly, a reminder of the harsh realities of survival in this beautiful but unforgiving land. Nathaniel built a small fire, its warm glow creating a circle of safety in the gathering dusk. From his pack, he produced strips of dried rabbit meat, offering some to Adelaide. "Eat," he said. "Your body needs strength to fight the infection." Adelaide forced herself to chew the tough meat despite having little appetite. Nathaniel sat across from her, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. He didn't speak, seemingly comfortable with silence in a way few people were. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks upward to join the emerging stars. From somewhere in the distance came the lonely howl of a coyote, answered by another farther away. "Have you saved others like me?" Adelaide finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Nathaniel's gaze remained fixed on the fire for a long moment before he answered. "Sometimes I save people," he said quietly. "Sometimes I only help them leave this world with less pain." The simple honesty of his response sent a chill through Adelaide that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "Which am I?" Am I?" she asked. His dark eyes met hers across the flames. "That's not for me to decide. Your body will fight, or it won't. But I'll do what I can to help it win." As night fully descended, Adelaide's condition worsened. Fever set in, bringing with it waves of chills that shook her entire body. Nathaniel placed his own blanket over her, then dampened a cloth with water from his canteen to cool her forehead. In her feverish state, the boundaries between past and present, reality and nightmare, began to blur. The fire before her transformed into the inferno that had consumed the Boston Public Library, where she had worked alongside her brother Daniel. "The books," she murmured, reaching out to invisible shelves. "Save the books." "Shh," Nathaniel soothed, re-wetting the cloth. "You're safe now." But safety was an illusion. In her fever dreams, Adelaide was back in Boston, standing outside the burning library. Flames licked at the windows, black smoke billowing into the night sky. And somewhere inside, Daniel, her little brother, the brilliant scholar who loved ancient texts more than anything in the world. "Daniel," she cried out, trying to sit up. "The fire. We have to." Nathaniel's strong hands gently pressed her back down. "It's the fever talking," he said. "There's no fire here." But there had been a fire. 3 years ago. A fire that had taken everything. Her brother, her purpose, her belief in a just world. A fire that had been her fault. Through the night, Nathaniel kept vigil. When Adelaide woke briefly during the darkest hours, she found him sitting nearby, illuminated by the low glow of the fire. In his hands was a small piece of wood, which he was carefully shaping with a pocket knife. His movements were precise, almost meditative, as he carved intricate patterns into the pale pine. The sight was strangely comforting, and Adelaide drifted back into uneasy sleep, her dreams now filled with flying creatures and hands that created beauty from simple things. Morning arrived with a gentle touch of sunlight and the distant call of meadowlarks. Adelaide opened her eyes, surprised to find herself still alive. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. Nathaniel was already awake, tending to a small fire where a pot of coffee brewed. He looked up as she stirred, his expression revealing nothing of the long night's vigil. "You made it through the night," he said, pouring a cup of the strong black coffee. "That's a good sign." Adelaide attempted to sit up, grimacing at the stiffness in her body. Nathaniel moved to her side, supporting her back as she adjusted her position. "Thank you," she said, accepting the offered cup with shaking hands. "For everything." He nodded once but said nothing. As she sipped the bitter coffee, Adelaide noticed a small wooden object beside her blanket. It was an intricately carved eagle, wings outstretched in flight. Every feather was detailed with remarkable precision, the eyes seeming to hold an intelligence beyond mere craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" she asked, carefully picking up the carving. Nathaniel nodded. "Last night while you slept." "It's beautiful," she said, running her finger along the smooth wooden wings. "Why an eagle?" "The Crow people believe that carving the image of something you fear helps you face it," he replied, watching her closely. "Last night, in your fever, you cried out about eagles. You seemed afraid of them." Adelaide stared at him, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with her condition. "How could you know? I've never told anyone about that fear." Nathaniel's dark eyes held hers steadily. "I've seen you before, Adelaide Morgan. You don't remember me, but I do you." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Adelaide's mind raced, searching her memories for this man's face, finding nothing. "What do you mean?" she finally asked. "Where would we have met?" But before Nathaniel could answer, a sound from the nearby brush silenced them both. The distinct snap of a twig, followed by the soft scuff of a boot on dry earth. Nathaniel was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. He positioned himself between Adelaide and the direction of the sound, his body tense but balanced, ready for whatever might emerge. "Stay still," he murmured to her, eyes never leaving the brush line. Two men stepped into the small clearing. Adelaide recognized them immediately, the same pair who had attacked the stagecoach. One was older, perhaps in his 50s, with a face weathered by sun and hardship into deep creases. A scar ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent sneer. The younger man was thin, almost gaunt, with several days' worth of beard and eyes that darted nervously between Nathaniel and Adelaide. "Well, look what we found," the older man drawled, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "If it ain't a half-breed and the lady from the coach." "Clayton," the younger man muttered, "maybe we should just move on. There's nothing here worth—" "Shut up, Reuben," Clayton snapped. His gaze shifted back to Nathaniel. Reuben's eyes darted nervously between Clayton and their potential victims. Unlike his companion's weathered face that showed years of frontier hardship, Reuben's features retained a softness that suggested he hadn't been living this life for long. A faded photograph peeked from his shirt pocket, a woman holding a small child. "We're just looking for some hospitality, Injun. Maybe share whatever's in those saddlebags." Nathaniel remained perfectly still, his expression impossible to read. "There's nothing here for you," he said, his voice low but clear. "The woman is injured. Move on." Clayton's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Adelaide. "That's so. She looks mighty familiar. Like someone who might know where the stagecoach strongbox ended up." Adelaide tensed. The strongbox, she hadn't even thought about it during her desperate escape. Clayton took a step forward. "Maybe the lady and I should have a little chat about—" The movement was so fast that Adelaide almost missed it. One moment, Nathaniel was standing still. The next, his revolver was drawn and a shot cracked through the morning air. Dirt exploded at Clayton's feet, just inches from his boot. Clayton froze, his face contorting with rage and surprise. "Next one won't miss," Nathaniel said quietly. For a long moment, no one moved. The echo of the gunshot faded into the vast landscape. Birds that had scattered at the sound cautiously resumed their morning songs. Clayton's hand hovered near his gun, but something in Nathaniel's stance, or perhaps the deadly calm in his eyes, made him reconsider. With a muttered curse, he stepped back. "This ain't over," he spat. "Come on, Reuben." The two men retreated, disappearing back into the brush from which they had emerged. Nathaniel remained watchful until the sound of their footsteps had faded completely. Only then did he holster his weapon and turn back to Adelaide. "Why didn't you kill them?" she asked. "They would have killed us." Nathaniel's expression was unreadable as he knelt to check on her wound. "You want me to become a murderer? To prove I'm not a murderer? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. As the day progressed, Adelaide's condition deteriorated. The brief reprieve of the morning gave way to a new surge of fever by midday. The wound, despite Nathaniel's careful treatment, had grown more inflamed, the skin around it turning an alarming shade of dark purple. Nathaniel examined it with growing concern, his fingers gently probing the swollen area. It's bad, he finally said, meeting Adelaide's eyes. The infection is spreading. I need to open the wound to release the poison. Fear clutched at Adelaide's heart. Will I lose my leg? She whispered. Nathaniel held her gaze steadily. If we don't do this, you'll lose much more than that. He moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the procedure. He built up the fire, placing his knife blade in the flames until it glowed red hot. From his saddlebags, he produced fresh bandages and more of the dried herbs, along with the bottle of whiskey. Drink, he instructed, offering her the bottle. It won't block all the pain, but it will help. Adelaide took a long swallow, the liquor burning a path down her throat. As the warmth spread through her body, she watched Nathaniel prepare with the calm precision of someone who had done this many times before. How do you know what to do? She asked, her voice slightly slurred from the whiskey and fever. You said you weren't a doctor. Nathaniel paused in his preparations, something flickering in his dark eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a ghost. I was an assistant to an army surgeon during the war between the states, he said after a moment, but I didn't fight for either side. How is that possible? His hands continued their work, checking the heat of the blade. I treated wounds on both sides. My mother was Crow, taught me about healing herbs and poultices. My father was an army doctor, taught me about surgery and stitches. He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. War taught me that the color of a man's skin, the uniform he wears, or the oath he swears doesn't change the value of his blood. Pain speaks a universal language. Before Adelaide could respond, Nathaniel removed the knife from the fire. The blade glowed orange-red in the afternoon light. This will hurt, he said, his voice gentle but firm. But I'll be quick. Adelaide nodded, her throat too tight for words. Nathaniel handed her a strip of leather. Bite down on this, he instructed, and whatever you do, try not to move. She placed the leather between her teeth, the taste of salt and sweat filling her mouth. Nathaniel positioned himself beside her injured leg, his face set in lines of concentration. The first touch of the hot blade against her inflamed thigh sent a shock of pain so intense that Adelaide thought she might pass out. Her back arched, a muffled scream escaping around the leather strip. Nathaniel worked quickly, making a precise incision along the deep gash to release the trapped infection. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the pine-scented air. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the pine-scented air. Through a haze of pain, Adelaide was aware of Nathaniel's movements. Calm, methodical, his hands never hesitating. Foul-smelling pus drained from the wound, bringing with it a wave of relief as the pressure decreased. Almost done, Nathaniel murmured, now cleaning the opened wound with whiskey. The edges of Adelaide's vision began to darken. The pain, the whiskey, the release of pressure, it was all too much. As consciousness slipped away, she was vaguely aware of Nathaniel applying the herbal poultice and wrapping her leg with clean bandages. Then darkness claimed her, and she fell into dreams of fire. In her fevered sleep, Adelaide stood once more before the burning library. Flames licked at the ornate stone facade, black smoke billowing into the night sky. Books, hundreds of precious volumes were burning inside, their pages curling and blackening in the inferno. But it wasn't the books that made her scream. It was the knowledge that Daniel was still inside, trapped among the burning shelves, trying to save an ancient manuscript that had been his passion. In the dream, Adelaide ran toward the burning building, only to be held back by strong arms. She fought against them, calling her brother's name until her voice gave out. But it was too late. It had always been too late. When she finally woke, the sky above had turned to deep twilight, stars beginning to appear in the darkening blue. Adelaide's body felt leaden, drained of all energy, but her mind was surprisingly clear. The fever had broken again, this time more completely. Nathaniel sat nearby, his attention focused on a new piece of wood in his hands. His knife moved in small, precise cuts, revealing a shape within the pale pine. Adelaide watched him work, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of his movements. "What are you carving?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. Nathaniel looked up, his expression softening slightly at seeing her awake. "A library," he said simply. "You spoke of books while you were dreaming." Adelaide felt a pang in her chest at his words. "My brother loved books," she said softly. "He died trying to save them." Nathaniel's hand stilled. "The fire you called out about." It wasn't a question, but Adelaide nodded anyway. 3 years ago, the Boston Public Library. Daniel was a scholar there, specializing in rare manuscripts. She paused, the memory still raw despite the passage of time. "I was the head librarian. That night, I left early to meet a gentleman friend. I was supposed to check all the rooms, make sure no candles were left burning." Her voice trailed off, the guilt threatening to choke her. "You blame yourself," Nathaniel observed, his tone neither accusatory nor sympathetic, simply stating a fact. Adelaide closed her eyes briefly. "I locked the front doors without checking the reading room. Daniel had fallen asleep among his books. When the fire started, he couldn't get out." The admission hung in the air between them, the first time she had spoken the full truth aloud to anyone. In Boston, she had maintained the official story that Daniel had returned after hours to retrieve a manuscript, that no one could have known he was there. "Guilt is a heavy burden to carry across a continent," Nathaniel said at last, his knife resuming its steady work on the carving. "Is that why you came where to Bayas?" Adelaide asked. "To escape a burden?" A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "We all carry our ghosts, Adelaide Morgan. The question is whether we let them haunt us or guide us." The night deepened around them, the fire casting long shadows against the rocks nearby. Adelaide felt strangely at peace despite the pain in her leg and the exhaustion in her body. Perhaps it was the simple act of speaking her guilt aloud, or perhaps it was the quiet presence of this enigmatic man who seemed to understand suffering without judgment. As she drifted toward his sleep once more, a question surfaced in her mind. "You said you've seen me before," she murmured, her eyes growing heavy. "When? Where?" But if Nathaniel answered, Adelaide didn't hear it. Sleep claimed her once more, this time bringing dreams not of fire but of flying, soaring high above the mountains with wings carved from pale pine. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Adelaide woke to find her legs significantly less painful, though still far from healed. Nathaniel had changed the bandages while she slept, applying a fresh poultice of herbs. He was nowhere to be seen, but a cup of coffee sat cooling beside her, along with a strip of dried meat. Adelaide pushed herself into a sitting position, testing her strength. She felt weak but more clear-headed than she had since the attack. Movement caught her eye. Nathaniel emerging from the trees, carrying several rabbits he had trapped for their breakfast. He nodded at seeing her awake, but said nothing as he set about preparing the meal. Adelaide watched him work, questions forming and dissolving in her mind. Who was this man, really? How had their paths crossed before? And why did he help her, a stranger, with such dedication? As if sensing her thoughts, Nathaniel spoke without looking up from his task. "Your fever's broken properly now. Another day of rest, and we can start moving towards Sweetwater Junction." "Thank you," Adelaide said, the words feeling inadequate for all he had done. "I don't know how to repay you." Nathaniel glanced up briefly. Living is repayment enough. They ate in companionable silence, the morning sun warming the air around them. After the meal, Nathaniel checked Adelaide's wound again, nodding with satisfaction at its improved appearance. "The infection is retreating," he said. "You're strong." "Or lucky," Adelaide replied, "if you hadn't found me." "But I did," he said simply, as if that ended all speculation. A light rain began to fall in the afternoon, gentle at first, but growing steadier. Nathaniel helped Adelaide to a small cave in the nearby hillside, little more than an overhang, but enough to shelter them from the weather. The confined space brought them physically closer than they had been before. Adelaide was acutely aware of Nathaniel's presence beside her, the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him, the quiet strength in his stillness. Outside, the rain intensified, creating a silver curtain across the cave entrance. The steady patter on stone and earth filled the silence between them. "Tell me about your family," Adelaide said at last, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from their proximity. Nathaniel's profile remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the rain beyond the cave. For a moment, Adelaide thought he would not answer. My mother was killed when raiders attacked her village, he finally said, his voice low but steady. I was 10. My father, the army doctor who had married her against everyone's advice, couldn't bear the loss. He put his service revolver in his mouth a year later. The stark brutality of the account stunned Adelaide into silence. When she found her voice again, it was barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. Nathaniel's shoulders moved in the slightest of shrugs. I carry two worlds inside me, and neither fully accepts me. To white men, I'm a breed not to be trusted. To the Crow, I'm an outsider who carries the blood of their oppressors. He turned to face her then, his dark eyes reflecting the dim light from the cave entrance. We are not so different, you and I, both caught between worlds. Yours of guilt and redemption, mine of heritage and belonging. Adelaide had never thought of her situation in such terms, but his words resonated with a truth she couldn't deny. She had been living in a liminal space since the fire, no longer the respected librarian, not yet whatever she might become in the West. Is that why you help people? She asked. To find belonging? A rare smile ghosted across Nathaniel's features. Perhaps, or perhaps I simply understand what it is to be wounded in ways others cannot see. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening, keeping them confined to the small cave. As darkness fell, Nathaniel built a small fire near the entrance, where the smoke could escape. The flames cast dancing shadows against the stone walls, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. Adelaide found herself sharing stories of Daniel, not the tragic end, but the bright, curious boy who had grown into a passionate scholar. She spoke of their childhood in Boston, their parents who had valued education above all else, the hours spent reading together by lamplight. In turn, Nathaniel told her of his years after his parents' deaths, taken in by an army doctor named Elijah Montgomery, who had been his father's friend. How Montgomery had taught him medicine while respecting his mother's Crow heritage, encouraging him to maintain both traditions. He was a good man, Nathaniel said, his voice softening with memory. One of the few who saw people as people, not as colors or tribes. What happened to him? Adelaide asked. Nathaniel's expression closed slightly. He died during the war. There was more to that story, Adelaide sensed, but Nathaniel had already retreated into silence, his hands busy with a new piece of wood and his knife. Sleep came easier that night, the sound of rain and the warmth of the small fire creating a cocoon of safety. Adelaide's dreams were peaceful for the first time in many nights, filled with images of books with wooden covers and pages that transformed into wings. The morning brought clearing skies and a decision. Adelaide's wound was healing well. The worst of the infection subsided. She could sit up without assistance and even stand briefly, though putting weight on her injured leg was still too painful. We should move tomorrow, Nathaniel said as he changed her bandage. Those men could return, and you need proper rest in a real bed. Adelaide nodded, a mixture of relief and something like disappointment flowing through her. Relief at the prospect of reaching Sweetwater Junction, beginning the life she had planned. Disappointment at the thought of parting from this enigmatic man who had saved her life. Will you tell me now? She asked. Where you have seen me before? Nathaniel's hands stilled momentarily in their work. He seemed about to speak when his head snapped up, attention focused on something beyond their camp. Someone's coming, he said quietly, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. Several horses. Adelaide felt her heart rate increase. Had Clayton and Reuben returned with reinforcements? Nathaniel positioned himself between Adelaide and the approaching riders, his hand resting lightly on his holstered revolver. His posture was relaxed but alert, ready to move at the first sign of threat. 3 riders emerged from the tree line. The man in front was tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed white beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He wore a black vest over a crisp white shirt, a silver star pinned to his chest. Behind him rode 2 younger men, clearly deputies from their similar attire. Judge Solomon Pierce, Nathaniel murmured to Adelaide, recognition and something like wariness in his voice. The older man reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away, his keen eyes taking in the scene. Adelaide sitting with her bandaged leg, Nathaniel standing protectively nearby. Good Lord, the judge said, his voice carrying across the clearing. The Carver. I've been tracking you across 3 states. Adelaide glanced at Nathaniel, confusion plain on her face. The carver? Nathaniel's expression remained neutral, but she sensed a new tension in his stance. I'm not causing trouble, Judge. Just helping an injured woman. Pierce dismounted, handing his reins to one of his deputies. He approached slowly, his gaze never leaving Nathaniel. 3 dead men in Montana might disagree with your assessment of not causing trouble, the judge said evenly. A chill ran through Adelaide. Dead men? She looked at Nathaniel, this man who had treated her wound with such gentle care, who had stayed awake through the night to watch over her fever. What is he talking about? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel didn't answer, his attention fixed on the judge. That was different, he said quietly. Pierce's eyes shifted to Adelaide, taking in her injured leg and pale complexion. Miss, are you being held here against your will? No, Adelaide replied immediately. He saved my life. I was attacked by roadside bandits, left for dead. Mr. Redfeather found me, treated my wound, kept the infection from spreading. Something like surprise flickered in the judge's weathered face. He studied Nathaniel with renewed interest. Redfeather isn't quite the man he appears to be, miss. He paused, waiting for her name. Morgan, she supplied. Adelaide Morgan. And I don't care who he appears to be. I know who he is by his actions. A small smile touched the corner of Pierce's mouth. Well said, Miss Morgan. He turned back to Nathaniel. But the law doesn't always share such a nuanced view. Does it? Redfeather. The tension in the air was palpable. Adelaide sensed that her fate, and perhaps Nathaniel's, hung in the balance of this encounter. Pierce sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his thinning white hair. 3 men, Redfeather. That's not something I can simply overlook, no matter the circumstances. They burned my mother's village, Nathaniel replied, his voice perfectly steady. They violated the women. Children died in those fires. Adelaide felt her breath catch. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Nathaniel's story of his mother's death, his quiet competence with wounds, his understanding of suffering. The judge was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Nathaniel's face. At last he spoke. The law doesn't concern itself with reasons, Redfeather, but I do. He glanced at Adelaide again, then back to Nathaniel. Miss Morgan needs medical attention beyond what can be provided in the wilderness. Sweetwater Junction is still a day's ride away. I know, Nathaniel replied. Pierce nodded slowly as if coming to a decision. Here's what's going to happen. You'll take Miss Morgan to Sweetwater Junction, see that she's properly settled. Then you and I will have a longer conversation about Montana. It was not a request, and Nathaniel knew it. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. 1 week, the judge continued. That's how long you have before I expect to see you in my courtroom in Lander. Do we understand each other? Yes, Nathaniel said simply. Pierce replaced his hat, glancing once more at Adelaide. Miss Morgan, I wish you a swift recovery. Sweetwater Junction will be fortunate to have someone of your evident character. With that, he returned to his horse, mounted, and with a final nod to Nathaniel, led his deputies back the way they had come. When they had disappeared from sight, Adelaide turned to Nathaniel, questions burning in her mind. But before she could speak, he held up a hand. Not now, he said quietly. We need to prepare for tomorrow's journey. He moved away, beginning to gather their few belongings, his back to her. Adelaide watched him, this man who had saved her life, who carved beauty from simple wood, who apparently had killed 3 men in Montana. The mystery of Nathaniel Redfeather had only deepened, and Adelaide found herself both afraid of and drawn to the answers that awaited her. As dusk fell, Nathaniel sat by the fire, finishing the small wooden carving he had started the night before. Adelaide watched as the library took shape beneath his skilled hands, a miniature building with tiny windows and a domed roof, remarkably similar to the Boston Public Library she had described. When it was complete, he handed it to her without ceremony. Why do you make these? She asked, turning the delicate carving in her hands. Nathaniel's eyes reflected the firelight as he regarded her across the flames. The Crow believed that when you create something, you put a piece of your spirit into it. When you give it away, that spirit stays with the receiver. Adelaide felt the weight of his words, understanding the gift was more significant than its small size might suggest. Thank you, she said softly. Nathaniel nodded once, then returned to preparing for their departure the next day. But as Adelaide held the wooden library in her palm, a question formed in her mind that would not be silenced. Who was Nathaniel Redfeather, really? And what would happen when Judge Pierce's one-week reprieve came to an end? Dawn broke with ribbons of amber and rose stretching across the eastern sky. A light frost coated the grass around their camp, glittering in the first rays of sunlight. Nathaniel had been awake for hours, packing their meager belongings and preparing for the journey ahead. Adelaide watched him work, struck by the economy of his movements. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. Like his carvings, precise cuts that revealed what was already there, waiting to be discovered. "Can you stand?" he asked, approaching with a steaming cup of coffee. Adelaide nodded, accepting the cup gratefully. With Nathaniel's assistance, she rose to her feet, testing her injured leg. Pain shot through her thigh, but it was duller now, more manageable than the searing agony of days before. The swelling had subsided considerably, though the skin remained discolored and tender. "Good," Nathaniel said, observing her cautiously shift weight from one foot to the other. "We'll need to ride double. My horse can handle both of us, but it will slow our pace." He helped her to a nearby boulder where she could sit while he finished breaking camp. As the coffee warmed her from within, Adelaide's mind returned to the previous day's encounter with Judge Pierce. The revelations about Nathaniel, or rather the hints of revelations, had left her with more questions than answers. "Are you going to tell me?" she asked at last, when the silence between them had stretched too long. Nathaniel continued his work, securing his saddlebags. "About Montana?" "About everything. The judge called you the Carver. 3 dead men in Montana. You said you'd seen me before." Adelaide set her empty cup aside. "I think I deserve to know who's taking me to Sweetwater Junction." Nathaniel straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "Would it change anything? Would you refuse my help if you knew?" The question gave Adelaide pause. Would it change things? This man had saved her life, tended her wound, kept vigil through her fever. Yet she knew almost nothing about him beyond what little he had shared. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I'd rather judge you based on the whole truth than half-truths." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed Nathaniel's features. He nodded once, then returned to his preparations. "We'll talk on the trail," he said. "It's a long ride to Sweetwater Junction." Mounting the horse proved more challenging than Adelaide had anticipated. Despite her determination, her injured leg couldn't bear weight long enough to use the stirrup. After several painful attempts, Nathaniel solved the problem by lifting her bodily onto the saddle, his strong hands circling her waist with surprising gentleness. The intimacy of the gesture left Adelaide momentarily flustered. In Boston, such physical contact would have been scandalous. Here in the wilderness, practicality superseded propriety. Nathaniel swung up behind her, his chest a solid presence against her back. He reached around her to take the reins, creating a secure space that both steadied her and made her acutely aware of their proximity. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Adelaide nodded, not trusting her voice. With a soft click of Nathaniel's tongue, the horse began to move, picking its way carefully through the rocky terrain toward the main trail. They rode in silence for the first hour, the rhythmic sway of the horse lulling Adelaide into a strange, peaceful state despite her discomfort. The landscape changed gradually as they descended from the higher elevations, pine forests giving way to rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and juniper. Finally, when the sun had climbed higher in the sky, Nathaniel spoke. "They call me the Carver because of what I left with each man I killed," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "A small wooden figure, carved in the shape of a crow." Adelaide tensed slightly but didn't interrupt. 3 men raided a Crow settlement near the Montana border 2 years ago," he continued. "They were drunk, angry about some perceived slight. They burned lodges, shot anyone who resisted. 5 died, including 2 children." His voice remained steady, but Adelaide sensed the carefully controlled emotion beneath the words. "I tracked them for 6 months. One by one, I found them. One in a mining camp near Helena, one working a ranch outside Bozeman. The last dealing cards in a saloon in Virginia City." "You killed them?" Adelaide asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Adelaide felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the morning chill. "Why leave the carvings?" she asked. "So they would know why they were dying," Nathaniel replied. "And so others would know there are consequences, even on the frontier." They rode in silence for several minutes, Adelaide absorbing this new information. Part of her was horrified at the calculated nature of Nathaniel's vengeance. Another part, a part she wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging, understood his actions in a way her proper Boston upbringing would have condemned. "And Judge Pierce?" she finally asked. "How does he fit into this?" Nathaniel adjusted the reins slightly as they navigated around a fallen log. "Pierce is a territorial judge, different from most. He believes in justice, not just law. He's been tracking me since the last killing, but I think he's less interested in hanging me than in understanding why I did what I did. He has men stationed throughout the territory, deputies, scouts, informants, not an official network, but loyal to him. If we don't arrive in Sweetwater Junction when expected, he'll send them looking. Pierce doesn't abandon those he considers under his protection. Will he arrest you after we reach Sweetwater Junction?" She felt rather than saw Nathaniel's shrug. "Perhaps that's why he gave me a week. It's his way of saying he sees the gray areas, even if the law doesn't." The trail widened as they entered a broad valley, allowing the horse to increase its pace slightly. The motion aggravated Adelaide's wound, sending fresh waves of pain through her leg. She bit her lip to keep from making a sound, but Nathaniel sensed her distress. "We'll rest soon," he said, his voice gentler than before. "There's a stream ahead where we can stop." True to his word, they halted beside a small creek about an hour later. Nathaniel helped Adelaide dismount, supporting her weight as she tested her leg on solid ground. The pain had intensified during the ride, and she couldn't suppress a grimace as she settled on a smooth boulder near the water's edge. Nathaniel knelt to examine her wounded thigh, carefully unwrapping the bandage. The deep gash looked better than the day before, less angry red, though still badly bruised. "The riding hasn't done it any favors," he said, "but the infection is still retreating. I'll apply fresh herbs." "The riding hasn't done it any favors," he said, "but the infection is still retreating. I'll apply fresh herbs." While working, Nathaniel's eyes scanned the horizon. "Pierce is a thorough man," he said quietly. "By now he'll have realized we're overdue at Sweetwater Junction. He's not the type to simply wait and wonder." As he worked, Adelaide studied his face. The planes and angles that spoke of his mixed heritage, the small scars that hinted at a life of hardship. His dark eyes, focused on her wound, revealed nothing of his thoughts. "You said you'd seen me before," she said, breaking the silence. "When?" Nathaniel's hands paused briefly, then resumed their careful ministrations. "Boston," he replied, "3 years ago, after the fire." Adelaide's heart quickened. "You were in Boston? During the library fire?" "After," he corrected, securing the fresh bandage. "I was there with Dr. Montgomery. He had colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital who'd invited him to lecture. We read about the fire in the newspapers, went to see the damage." He sat back on his heels, meeting her gaze directly. "I saw you standing outside the ruins the next morning. You were staring at the building like you were trying to will it back into existence. I remember thinking I'd never seen someone look so haunted." The memory hit Adelaide with unexpected force, herself, sleepless and ash-covered, returning to the charred skeleton of the library at dawn. The acrid smell of wet, burned wood, the blackened stone facade, windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The absolute certainty that part of her had died in that fire alongside Daniel. "I don't remember seeing you," she said softly. "No reason you should," Nathaniel replied, rising to his feet. "Just another face in the crowd of onlookers. But I remembered you." He moved away to refill their canteen in the stream, leaving Adelaide to absorb this strange connection. Of all the unlikely coincidences, that this man who had saved her life in the Wyoming wilderness had witnessed her at her most vulnerable moment thousands of miles away. Was it truly coincidence? Or something else? They continued their journey after a brief rest, the terrain growing more challenging as they approached a steep ridge that separated them from the valley beyond. Nathaniel guided the horse carefully up the narrow switchback trail, one hand on the reins, the other arm wrapped protectively around Adelaide's waist to keep her steady. At the crest, he reined in, allowing them both to catch their breath and the horse to rest. The view from the ridge was spectacular, rolling hills stretching to the horizon, the distant peaks of the Wind River Range gleaming with early snow, a silver ribbon of river winding through the valley below. "Sweetwater Valley," Nathaniel said, nodding toward the distant settlement, visible as tiny specks of buildings where the river curved. "We should reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we make good time." Adelaide felt a complex mix of emotions at the sight of her destination. Relief that the journey was nearing its end, anticipation of beginning her new life as a teacher, and unexpectedly, a touch of regret that her time with Nathaniel would soon conclude. "What will you do?" she asked. "After you take me there?" Nathaniel was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Meet with Pierce, as agreed," he finally said. "After that, I don't know." Something in his tone made Adelaide turn to look at him. For the first time since she'd met him, Nathaniel seemed uncertain. "You could stay," she suggested, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. "Sweetwater Junction could use someone with your skills." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "A half-breed killer with a knack for whittling? I'm not sure the good people of Sweetwater would agree." "A healer," Adelaide corrected firmly. "Someone who knows both worlds and can bridge them. The settlement sits between white territory and native lands. Someone like you could be valuable there." Nathaniel didn't respond, but she felt him considering her words as they began their descent into the valley. They made camp that evening in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods near the river. The temperature dropped rapidly with the setting sun, prompting Nathaniel to build a larger fire than usual. Adelaide sat close to the flames, grateful for their warmth, watching as Nathaniel prepared a simple meal of jerky, softened in a pan of hot water, with wild onions and dried berries. "It's not Boston cuisine," he said, offering her a tin plate, "but it will keep your strength up." Adelaide accepted it with a smile. After days of nothing but jerky, this looks like a feast. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant rush of the river. As they finished their meal, Adelaide noticed Nathaniel glancing repeatedly toward the ridge they had crossed, his expression alert. "What is it?" she asked. "Not sure," he replied, rising to his feet. "Thought I saw movement along the skyline earlier. Could be nothing. Could be someone following our trail." A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air ran through Adelaide. "Clayton and Reuben? Possibly, or someone else entirely." Nathaniel checked his revolver, then added more wood to the fire. "I'll keep watch tonight. You should rest." Despite his reassurance, sleep eluded Adelaide. She lay wrapped in her blanket near the fire, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Nathaniel sat on the opposite side of the fire, his silhouette still as stone, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their camp. In the flickering firelight, she watched as he eventually took out his knife and a small piece of wood, hands moving in the familiar pattern of creation. The rhythmic sound of blade against wood was oddly comforting, a counterpoint to the wild symphony of the night. Adelaide must have drifted off eventually because she woke with a start to find the fire burned low and morning light filtering through the cottonwood branches. Nathaniel was already up, saddling the horse and preparing for departure. "Any trouble in the night?" she asked, wincing as she sat up. He shook his head. "Nothing definite, but we should move quickly today." They were on the trail again within the hour, the horse picking its way down the gradual slope toward the river valley. The morning was clear and crisp, the landscape gilded by autumn sunlight. Under different circumstances, Adelaide might have found it breathtakingly beautiful. Now she found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, searching for signs of pursuit. Midday found them crossing a shallow ford where the river widened and slowed. On the opposite bank stood a crude structure, a combination trading post and way station for travelers heading to the mining settlements farther west. As they approached, Nathaniel nodded toward a weather-beaten notice nailed beside the door, a description of a wanted man with Judge Pierce's signature at the bottom. Pierce's reach is wide in these parts. This is the third such notice I've seen since we left camp. His men will have passed through here recently. "We'll stop here," Nathaniel said, guiding the horse toward the weathered building. "Rest the horse. Check your wound." A bell jangled as they entered the dimly lit interior. The trading post was sparsely stocked, but offered the basic necessities for frontier life: ammunition, flour, coffee, tobacco, and a meager selection of canned goods. Behind a rough-hewn counter stood the proprietor, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and suspicious eyes. "Afternoon," he grunted, his gaze moving from Adelaide to Nathaniel and back again. His expression shifted subtly upon noticing Nathaniel's heritage, a flicker of distrust crossing his features. Need supplies, Nathaniel said, seemingly oblivious to the man's reaction. Coffee, jerky, bandages if you have them. As the proprietor gathered the items, the door opened again, admitting an older man wearing the worn uniform of a firefighter. His left hand was badly scarred with burned tissue, and he walked with a slight limp. He nodded politely to Adelaide, then froze as his gaze fell on her face. "Good Lord," he exclaimed. "Miss Morgan? Adelaide Morgan from the Boston Library? I thought you perished in that fire." Adelaide stared at the man, struggling to place him. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "Maxwell Garrett," he replied, removing his hat. "Boston Fire Brigade. I was there that night, the library fire. Led the team that tried to save the East Wing." Recognition dawned. Adelaide remembered him now, a younger, less weathered version of this man, his face blackened with soot as he directed his men into the burning building. "Mr. Garrett," she acknowledged, inclining her head. "I didn't die, as you can see, though my brother wasn't so fortunate." Garrett removed his hat, revealing a patchwork of burn scars that continued from his hand up his arm. "I tried to reach him, Miss Morgan. Went back in 3 times before the ceiling collapsed." He tapped his leg with a hollow sound. "Lost half this leg in the effort. Been chasing that night ever since, trying to make sense of it. Followed the rumors west when I heard whispers about pages saved from rare books. Figured if I couldn't save your brother, maybe I could help finish what he started." Garrett's face fell. "Daniel, yes, a terrible tragedy. We found him in the rare manuscript room. He'd tried to save some of the texts, had pages from an old book clutched in his hand." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. "Pages? What pages?" Garrett shrugged. "Some ancient book, from what I heard later. The investigators found it strange, a few torn pages in his pocket, like he'd tried to preserve at least part of whatever he was studying." The revelation struck Adelaide like a physical blow. Daniel trying to save pages from a manuscript? She'd assumed he had simply fallen asleep among his books, trapped when the fire began. But this suggested something else entirely, that he had been awake, aware of the danger, making a conscious decision to rescue something he deemed valuable. Nathaniel, who had been quietly observing the exchange, moved closer to Adelaide, his presence steady and reassuring. "What happened to the pages?" he asked Garrett. "Evidence initially," the firefighter replied. "Part of the investigation into the cause of the fire. After that, I couldn't say." Adelaide's mind raced. The official investigation had ruled the fire an accident, a candle left burning in the main reading room. She'd accepted that finding, burdened by her own guilt at not checking the rooms before locking up. But if Daniel had been actively trying to save specific pages— "The fire," she said slowly. "Was it truly an accident?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the empty trading post. "Officially, yes," he said, lowering his voice. "Unofficially, there were aspects that troubled some of us. The speed with which it spread, the intensity in certain areas, particularly the rare manuscript room. But without proof," he trailed off with another shrug. "After 20 years with the brigade, I've seen enough fires to know when something doesn't fit the pattern. But proving arson, that's another matter entirely." Garrett's scarred hand clenched. "That night haunts me, Miss Morgan. Not just the lives lost, but the knowledge destroyed. Your brother once showed me medieval manuscripts that survived plague, war, and centuries of history, all gone in hours. I've spent 3 years tracking rumors, gathering evidence. Followed Hargrove's trail from Boston to Philadelphia to Chicago, always a step behind. When I heard about a school teacher heading to Wyoming with a trunk full of books—" His eyes met Adelaide's with unexpected intensity. "Some fires never stop burning, Miss Morgan. Not until justice douses them." Adelaide felt lightheaded, the implications of his words overwhelming. If the fire had been deliberately set, then Daniel's death wasn't her fault. At least, not entirely. And if he'd been trying to save specific pages, what had been so valuable about them? "Mr. Garrett," as she began, but was interrupted by the sudden opening of the door. A well-dressed man entered, his attire incongruously formal for the frontier setting. A tailored suit, polished boots, a gold watch chain visible across his waistcoat. His neatly trimmed beard framed a face that might have been handsome were it not for the coldness of his pale eyes. Those eyes widened slightly upon seeing Adelaide, a flash of recognition quickly masked by a practiced smile. Miss Morgan, he said, removing his hat with a flourish. What an unexpected pleasure. Victor Hargrove at your service. We met briefly in Boston, though I doubt you'd remember. Adelaide stared at the man, searching her memory. There was something vaguely familiar about him, perhaps from one of the many literary society functions she'd attended as head librarian, but the circumstances eluded her. I'm afraid I don't recall our meeting, Mr. Hargrove, she said carefully. No matter, he replied smoothly. It was a trying time, just after the unfortunate business with the library. I was a patron, occasionally consulted with your brother on certain rare texts. He turned to Nathaniel, his smile never reaching his eyes. And your companion is? Nathaniel Redfeather, Nathaniel replied, his voice neutral, but his posture subtly shifting to place himself more directly between Adelaide and the newcomer. Hargrove's gaze flicked over Nathaniel dismissively. Charmed, I'm sure. He returned his attention to Adelaide. What brings you to this God-forsaken wilderness, Miss Morgan? Quite a change from the hallowed halls of Boston's intellectual society. Before Adelaide could respond, the door burst open again. Clayton and Reuben stumbled in, dusty and travel-worn. They halted abruptly upon seeing Nathaniel and Adelaide, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The atmosphere in the small trading post shifted instantly from tense to potentially lethal. Well, well, Clayton drawled, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Look who we found, Reuben, the half-breed and the lady from the stagecoach. Nathaniel's expression remained impassive, but Adelaide saw his right hand drift closer to his own revolver. Gentlemen, Hargrove interjected smoothly, I see you're acquainted with my friends. Excellent. That simplifies matters. Clayton's eyes narrowed. Your friends? This engine nearly shot my foot off 3 days ago. A regrettable misunderstanding, I'm sure, Hargrove replied, his tone placating but with an undercurrent of authority that made Clayton hesitate. Mr. Redfeather was simply protecting Miss Morgan, as instructed. Adelaide stared at Hargrove in confusion. Instructed? What was this man talking about? Nathaniel's voice was dangerously quiet when he spoke. We've never met, Hargrove. Perhaps not formally, Hargrove acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head, but we share a common interest. His gaze shifted to Adelaide, or rather a common interest in what Miss Morgan possesses. A chill ran through Adelaide. I don't know what you're talking about. Hargrove's smile thinned. Come now, Miss Morgan. The pages your brother tore from the Codex Philosophorum before the fire consumed the rest. He gave them to you for safekeeping, did he not? The trading post fell silent. Adelaide felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. The Codex Philosophorum, Daniel's obsession in the months before the fire. An obscure medieval text purported to contain alchemical formulas and esoteric knowledge. He'd spoken of it often, excited by the library's recent acquisition of one of only 3 known copies in existence. But he hadn't given her any pages. She would have remembered. I don't have anything of the sort, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Hargrove studied her face, his pale eyes calculating. Interesting. Either you're an exceptional liar or... He paused, a new theory visibly forming. Or perhaps you don't realize what you have. He turned to Clayton and Reuben. Search their belongings. The pages might be hidden among her things. Clayton grinned, moving toward Adelaide, but Nathaniel stepped forward, blocking his path. Touch her belongings, Nathaniel said quietly, and it will be the last thing you do. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Maxwell Garrett backed slowly toward the door, clearly wanting no part of the brewing confrontation. The trading post proprietor ducked behind his counter. There's no need for violence, Hargrove said, though his tone suggested he was not opposed to it if necessary. Miss Morgan, I'm prepared to offer a substantial sum for those pages. $5,000, enough to establish your school in Sweetwater Junction quite comfortably with all the books you could desire. The amount was staggering, more money than Adelaide might earn in 20 years of teaching, but the very generosity of the offer confirmed the pages' importance, whatever they might be. I told you, I don't have them, she insisted. Hargrove sighed, his patience visibly thinning. Clayton, Reuben, restrain Mr. Redfeather. We'll conduct a more thorough search. Clayton drew his pistol, but Nathaniel was faster. In one fluid motion, he had his revolver in hand, cocked and aimed squarely at Hargrove's chest. No one is searching anything, Nathaniel said, his voice deadly calm. "The lady said she doesn't have your pages." Hargrove's composed facade cracked slightly, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, half-breed. Those pages contain knowledge worth far more than your miserable life." "Maybe so," Nathaniel replied evenly, "but at this range I won't miss. How much is your life worth, Hargrove?" For several heartbeats, no one moved. Adelaide held her breath, acutely aware that the slightest wrong move could trigger a bloodbath. Then, unexpectedly, Maxwell Garrett spoke from near the door. "The fire wasn't an accident, was it, Hargrove?" the old firefighter said, his scarred hand clenched into a fist. "You said it to cover up the theft of the codex." Hargrove's gaze flicked to Garrett, momentarily thrown by this new accusation. "Nonsense. I was a patron of the library, a supporter of—" "You were seen," Garrett interrupted, his voice stronger now, "by a night watchman from the building across the street, entering the library after hours, shortly before the fire was detected. The watchman came forward during the investigation, but his testimony was dismissed as unreliable due to his drinking habits." Adelaide felt as though she'd been struck. If Garrett was right, then Hargrove had not only stolen the codex but was responsible for Daniel's death. The realization hit her with physical force, a wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. Hargrove's expression hardened, the pretense of civility dropping away entirely. "The codex never should have been in that library in the first place," he said coldly. "Pearls before swine. Such knowledge belongs in the hands of those who understand its true value." "And the people who died in that fire?" Adelaide asked, finding her voice at last. "My brother? The night janitor? Or what was their value, Mr. Hargrove?" "Collateral damage," Hargrove replied dismissively. "Regrettable, but ultimately insignificant compared to what the codex offers." The casual cruelty of his response struck Adelaide like a slap. This man had murdered her brother, had burned down an entire library filled with irreplaceable knowledge, all for a few pages of an obscure text, and he spoke of it as collateral damage. "You're a monster," she whispered. Hargrove's lips curled in a cold smile. "History is written by those with the courage to seize power, Miss Morgan. In 100 years, no one will remember your brother's name, but the knowledge in those pages could reshape the very foundations of science and medicine." He gestured impatiently to Clayton and Reuben. "Enough talk. Take care of the half-breed and the old man. Miss Morgan and I need to have a more private conversation about those pages." Clayton raised his pistol, aiming at Nathaniel, but before he could fire, Nathaniel's revolver barked once. The bullet struck not Clayton, but the kerosene lamp hanging above the counter, plunging the trading post into sudden darkness. As the lamp crashed down, the flame extinguished. Chaos erupted. Adelaide felt strong hands grasp her arm, pulling her toward the door. Gunshots rang out, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the interior in ghostly bursts of light. Someone shouted in pain, Clayton or Reuben, she couldn't tell which. Then she was outside, blinking in the sudden sunlight, Nathaniel half dragging, half carrying her toward their horse. Behind them, more shots sounded from within the trading post. "Can you ride?" Nathaniel asked urgently, helping her mount. Adelaide nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain in her leg as she settled into the saddle. Nathaniel swung up behind her, and in an instant, they were galloping away from the trading post, heading toward the river. "They'll follow," Adelaide gasped, clinging to the saddle horn as the horse thundered across the open ground. "I'm counting on it," Nathaniel replied grimly. They rode hard for nearly an hour, following the river downstream until they reached a series of rocky bluffs. Nathaniel guided the horse into a narrow ravine, out of sight from the main trail. Only when they were well hidden did he finally slow their pace, allowing the exhausted animal to catch its breath. Adelaide's right thigh throbbed mercilessly, the wild ride having reopened the deep gash. Fresh blood soaked through the bandage, staining her torn dress. "You're bleeding again," Nathaniel observed, dismounting and helping her down from the saddle. "We need to stop and rebind it." "There isn't time," Adelaide protested. "Hargrove and his men—" "Will be following our obvious trail along the river," Nathaniel finished, "which is why we're no longer on it." He led her to a small hollow beneath an overhanging rock, concealed from view by a stand of junipers. The horse, tethered nearby, was similarly hidden from anyone passing on the trail below. As Nathaniel tended to her wound, Adelaide's mind raced with the revelations of the past hour. Hargrove had set the fire that killed Daniel. The mysterious pages from the Codex Philosophorum were valuable enough to kill for, and Hargrove believed she had them. But she didn't. Or did she? A memory surfaced, Daniel visiting her apartment the night before the fire, unusually agitated. He'd given her a book, not the Codex itself, but a volume of poetry he'd thought she'd enjoy. Had there been something hidden within its pages? The book was packed away in her trunk, which had been on the stagecoach when it was attacked. Nathaniel, she said slowly, I think I might know where those pages are after all. His hands paused in their work, dark eyes lifting to meet hers. The strong box from the stagecoach? Adelaide shook her head. My trunk. Daniel gave me a book the night before the fire, a collection of Wordsworth's poetry. I never thought, but he might have hidden the pages inside it. Nathaniel considered this, his expression thoughtful. If Hargrove is willing to follow you across the country for those pages, they must contain something truly valuable, or dangerous. Or both, Adelaide said softly. They fell silent as Nathaniel finished rebinding her wound. As he worked, his expression grew thoughtful. There's something I need to tell you, he said quietly. When I found you in the wilderness, you were clutching this. He reached carefully into an inner pocket of his vest and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, its edges charred and corners yellowed with age. Adelaide stared at it, bewildered. I don't remember having that. You were delirious with fever. After I treated your wound, I found it gripped in your hand. Nathaniel carefully unfolded one corner, revealing intricate symbols in faded ink. I didn't know what it was at first, but your fever dreams about Daniel, about the library. I suspected it might be valuable. So that's why you carved the eagle hollow, Adelaide whispered, understanding dawning. Nathaniel nodded. I created a copy, as precise as I could manage, and hid it inside the carving. The original I sealed in waxed leather and gave to a Shoshone trader heading to Lander the morning after I found you. I paid him well to deliver it directly to Judge Pierce. But how could you create such a convincing forgery? Adelaide asked. Nathaniel's hands stilled on the bandage. My father's friend, Dr. Montgomery, collected books on medieval alchemy. I grew up studying his texts, learning the symbols, the Latin phrasing. He secured the bandage and looked up. I wasn't certain what this was until I heard Hargrove mention the Codex Philosophorum at the trading post. Then everything made sense. He carefully refolded the parchment and returned it to his vest. The pages weren't in your book of poetry. You were already carrying one without knowing it. They fell silent as Nathaniel finished rebinding her wound. The bleeding had slowed, but the gash looked angry and inflamed from the day's exertions. You need proper medical attention, Nathaniel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sweetwater Junction is still half a day's riding from here. We'll rest until dusk, then continue under cover of darkness. Adelaide nodded, too exhausted to protest. As Nathaniel secured their makeshift camp, she leaned back against the cool stone of the overhang, closing her eyes against the afternoon sun. Daniel hadn't died because of her negligence. The knowledge should have brought relief, yet instead it brought a new burden, the responsibility of whatever was contained in those pages, pages her brother had died protecting. What do you think is in the Codex? She asked, opening her eyes to find Nathaniel seated nearby, whittling a small piece of wood. He considered the question, his knife continuing its steady work. Something people are willing to kill for, he replied simply. In my experience, that usually means one of three things: money, power, or secrets. Hargrove mentioned it could reshape science and medicine, Adelaide mused. That suggests knowledge of some kind. Knowledge is power, Nathaniel said, especially to men like Hargrove, who believe they're entitled to control it. Adelaide watched his hands as they shaped the wood, finding comfort in the familiar, methodical movements. What are you making? A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. A key, he said, holding up the partially carved piece. Indeed, it was taking the shape of an old-fashioned skeleton key, its bow intricately patterned with tiny leaves and vines. Why a key? Adelaide asked. Nathaniel's dark eyes met hers. Every lock has one. Every problem has a solution. Sometimes we just need to carve away what's unnecessary to find it. The simple wisdom of his words resonated with Adelaide. She had spent 3 years locked in grief and guilt, believing herself responsible for Daniel's death. Now discovering the truth about Hargrove and the fire, she felt as though a lock within her was finally opening, painful but necessary for healing to begin. As the afternoon waned, Adelaide drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with burning books and hidden pages covered in cryptic symbols. In her dream, Daniel stood in the midst of the flames, holding out a key carved from pale wood, his lips moving in words she couldn't hear. She woke with a start to find dusk had fallen, the landscape transformed by lengthening shadows. Nathaniel was already preparing for their departure, checking his revolver and saddling the horse. "Any sign of pursuit?" Adelaide asked, wincing as she shifted to a sitting position. Nathaniel shook his head. "Nothing yet, but they're out there. Hargrove isn't a man who gives up easily." As if to validate his assessment, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed through the ravine, followed by the whine of a bullet striking stone near their position. "Down!" Nathaniel commanded, pulling Adelaide deeper into the shelter of the overhang as a second shot followed the first. From their concealed position, Adelaide could see movement on the ridge above. 3 figures silhouetted against the darkening sky. Clayton, Reuben, and between them, the unmistakable formal attire of Victor Hargrove. "They found us," she whispered. Nathaniel's expression was grim but determined. "They found our trail. They haven't found us yet." He checked his revolver again, 4 bullets remaining. Not enough for a prolonged fight against 3 armed men. "We need to move," he said quietly. "Stay low and follow me." Keeping to the deepest shadows, they made their way along the base of the bluff, away from where their horse was tethered. Adelaide bit her lip against the pain in her leg, forcing herself to keep pace with Nathaniel's silent progress. Above them, voices carried in the still evening air. "They can't have gone far," Hargrove was saying, his cultured tones incongruous in the wilderness setting. "The woman is injured." "Trail leads down into that ravine," Clayton's rougher voice replied. "Could be holed up anywhere among them rocks." "Find them," Hargrove ordered. "The woman must be taken alive. The half-breed is expendable." Another shot rang out, this one striking the ground several yards ahead of Adelaide and Nathaniel. They froze, pressing themselves against the rock face as loose gravel clattered down from above. "There," Reuben shouted. "Movement by the junipers." Nathaniel pushed Adelaide behind a large boulder just as a fusillade of shots peppered the ground where they had been standing. He returned fire once, aiming not at the men, but at the loose rocks near their position. The bullet struck stone with a spark, sending a shower of fragments across the ridge. Someone cursed loudly, Clayton from the sound of it. The momentary distraction was all Nathaniel needed. "Run," he whispered to Adelaide, pointing toward a narrow crevice in the bluff face about 20 yards ahead. "I'll draw their fire." Before she could protest, he was moving in the opposite direction, firing twice more into the gathering darkness. The men on the ridge returned fire, their attention fixed on Nathaniel's fleeing figure. Adelaide hesitated only a moment before forcing her injured leg to carry her toward the indicated crevice. Pain shot through her with every step, but fear provided a powerful anesthetic. Behind her, gunfire continued to exchange, bullets whining off rock faces in deadly ricochets. The crevice was narrower than it had appeared, barely wide enough for Adelaide to squeeze through. Inside, she found herself in a small, natural chamber within the bluff. Faint starlight filtered through a crack in the ceiling, providing just enough illumination to see that the space was empty save for old animal bones and dust. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. Had Nathaniel been hit? Had he managed to escape? Or was he lying somewhere in the darkness, bleeding out onto Wyoming soil? Adelaide pressed herself against the cold stone wall, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what was happening. Minutes stretched like hours in the confined darkness. Then came a soft, scuffing sound from the crevice entrance. Adelaide held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard outside. "Adelaide?" Nathaniel's voice barely above a whisper, relief flooded through her. "Here," she breathed. Nathaniel squeezed through the narrow opening, a darker shadow in the already dim interior. Adelaide could see little of his face, but his breathing was labored, and he moved with less than his usual grace. "Are you hurt?" she asked urgently. "Grazed," he replied tersely. "Left arm, nothing serious." He settled beside her, his back against the stone wall. In the faint light, Adelaide could make out a dark stain spreading across his shirt sleeve. "Let me see," she insisted, reaching for his arm. Nathaniel didn't resist as she carefully rolled up his sleeve to reveal a bullet wound, a deep furrow across his bicep, bleeding freely but not life-threatening. "I need to bind it," she said. "With what?" Nathaniel's voice held a trace of grim humor. Adelaide hesitated only briefly before tearing a strip from the hem of her already ruined dress. The fabric was hardly clean, but it would have to do. With gentle efficiency, she wrapped the makeshift bandage around his arm, tying it securely. "Thank you," Nathaniel said quietly. They sat in silence for several moments, both listening for sounds of pursuit. The night had grown still outside, no voices or footsteps to indicate where their hunters might be. "What happened?" Adelaide finally asked. "I led them away from your position," Nathaniel explained. "Clayton took a shot at me, caught my arm. I returned fire, hit him in the leg. Not fatal, but enough to slow them down. Reuben was helping him back up the ridge when I circled around to find you." "And Hargrove?" "Directing them like a general," Nathaniel said, a note of contempt in his voice. "The type of man who has others do his killing for him." Adelaide leaned her head back against the cool stone. "What do we do now? They're between us and the horse." "We wait," Nathaniel replied simply. "They can't search effectively in the dark. By morning, we'll have a better sense of their position." "There's another reason to wait," he added, voice low. "Before we left our first campsite, I carved a series of trail markers, crow symbols, on trees along our planned route. Pierce's scouts know to look for them. If we've been followed, if we haven't arrived when expected, they'll track those markers to find us." The pragmatism of his response was oddly reassuring. Adelaide felt some of the tension leave her body, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. The events of the day, the revelations about Daniel's death, the confrontation at the trading post, the desperate flight through the ravine, had left her physically and emotionally drained. "Rest," Nathaniel said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll keep watch." Despite her intention to stay alert, Adelaide found her eyes growing heavy. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the sensation of Nathaniel's uninjured arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side where it was warmer, safer. In the small stone chamber, hidden from those who sought to harm them, Adelaide Morgan finally allowed herself to surrender to exhaustion, her head coming to rest against Nathaniel Redfeather's shoulder as the Wyoming night deepened around them. Adelaide woke to the soft touch of dawn light filtering through the crack in the ceiling of their stone sanctuary. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, cataloging sensations, the dull throb in her injured leg, the chill of the rock wall against her back, and the steady warmth of Nathaniel beside her. He hadn't slept. She could tell from the alertness in his posture, the way his head was tilted slightly toward the crevice entrance, listening. His injured arm was cradled against his chest, the makeshift bandage now dark with dried blood. "They're still out there," he said quietly, not turning his head. "Two of them, at least. I heard movement about an hour ago, down by where we left the horse." Adelaide straightened, wincing as stiffness in her muscles protested the movement. "Clayton and Reuben?" "Clayton's injured, probably Reuben keeping watch while Hargrove tends to him." Nathaniel finally looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. "How's your leg?" Adelaide shifted experimentally. The pain was present but duller than the previous day. "Better, I think. The bleeding stopped." Nathaniel nodded. "Good. We'll need to move soon. Sweetwater Junction is still half a day's ride, but we'll have to proceed on foot until we can recover the horse or find another means of transportation." The prospect of walking on her injured leg wasn't appealing, but Adelaide knew they had little choice. Staying hidden in the crevice might be safe temporarily, but without water or food, it would quickly become a death trap. "What's our plan?" she asked. Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful. "They expect us to continue towards Sweetwater Junction, so we don't. Where do we go instead?" "There's a Shoshone settlement about 10 miles west of here. People who know me who will offer shelter and help get word to Judge Pierce." Adelaide considered this. "Will they welcome a white woman?" A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "They'll welcome someone under my protection. The Shoshone have no quarrel with teachers, only with those who break promises or take what isn't theirs." He moved toward the narrow entrance, peering out cautiously. We'll wait until full light, then make our way along the bluff line. There's better cover to the west, and they'll be watching the trail to Sweetwater. As they waited for the sun to rise fully, Adelaide's mind returned to the revelations of the previous day. Victor Hargrove had set the fire that killed Daniel, seeking to steal the Codex Philosophorum. Her brother had torn out pages before his death, pages Hargrove now believed Adelaide possessed. What could be so valuable about those pages, she wondered aloud. What knowledge would be worth killing for? Nathaniel was silent for a moment, his knife working steadily on a small piece of wood. Not the key he'd been carving before, but something new. In my mother's tribe, he finally put, there were sacred stories passed down only to medicine people. Knowledge of plants that could heal or harm, rituals to communicate with the spirit world. The elders said if such knowledge fell into the wrong hands, it could bring great suffering. He glanced up at Adelaide. Your brother's codex might contain something similar. Dangerous knowledge that should remain hidden, or powerful knowledge that someone like Hargrove would misuse. The explanation made sense. Daniel had been fascinated by alchemical texts, by the intersection of ancient mysticism and early scientific understanding. The Codex Philosophorum was reportedly a treatise on transmutation, not just of metals into gold, as popular accounts suggested, but of more fundamental elements. Daniel once told me the Codex contained formulas that were centuries ahead of modern understanding, Adelaide said slowly. He said it was as if the author had glimpsed the future of science and encoded it in medieval language to protect it from those who would abuse it. That would certainly explain Hargrove's obsession, Nathaniel observed. Men like him value power above all else. The power to transform elements could make him unfathomably wealthy and influential. Adelaide fell silent, considering the implications. If Daniel had hidden pages from the Codex in that poetry book, and if those pages contained the knowledge Hargrove sought, then she was carrying something of immense and dangerous value without even realizing it. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the small chamber in golden light. Nathaniel rose carefully, checking his revolver. Only 2 bullets remained after the previous night's exchange of fire. Stay behind me, he instructed, moving toward the crevice entrance. Step where I step, and if I signal to stop, freeze immediately. Understand? Adelaide nodded, gathering her tattered skirts and preparing to follow him into the uncertain day ahead. Emerging from their stone shelter was like stepping into another world. The ravine was transformed by morning light, the red-gold sandstone cliffs glowing against the deep blue of the Wyoming sky. Under different circumstances, Adelaide might have found it breathtakingly beautiful. Now, every shadow held potential danger, every rustling bush a possible threat. Nathaniel moved with the silent grace of someone accustomed to navigating hostile territory. Despite his injured arm, he maintained a steady pace, staying close to the bluff face where shadows provided better concealment. Adelaide followed carefully, forcing her injured leg to cooperate despite its protests. They had covered perhaps half a mile when Nathaniel suddenly raised his hand in a warning gesture. Adelaide froze, straining her ears to detect what had alerted him. Then she heard it. Voices, carried on the morning breeze from somewhere up ahead. Nathaniel motioned her back against the cliff where an outcropping of rock provided minimal cover. Check the upper trail, a voice was saying. Hargrove's cultured tones, unmistakable even at a distance. They can't have gone far, not with both of them injured. I ain't climbing no more ridges with my leg like this, came Clayton's surly response. You want the half-breed dead so bad you can go after him yourself. Your incompetence continues to astound me, Hargrove replied coldly. I hired you for one simple task: intercept the woman's stagecoach and recover her belongings. Instead, you let her escape, failed to secure the trunk, and now you've managed to get yourself shot. You didn't say nothing about no Indian guide with a 6-shooter, Clayton protested. And we got the trunk, didn't we? Just wasn't no book with special pages in it. Adelaide's breath caught. They had her trunk, which meant they had already searched the poetry book Daniel had given her, but they hadn't found the pages, which suggested either that Daniel hadn't hidden them there after all, or that they were concealed in a way Hargrove's men had overlooked. Nathaniel leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. When they move on, we'll circle behind them. Try to reach the horse. Adelaide nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give away their position. The voices continued, growing slightly fainter as the men apparently moved along the ravine in the opposite direction. "Reuben," Hargrove was saying, "scout ahead toward that bend. They might have found shelter in one of these rock formations." "Yes, sir, Mr. Hargrove," came Reuben's voice, followed by the sound of footsteps on loose gravel. Nathaniel waited until the sounds had receded before gesturing for Adelaide to follow him. They moved quickly but silently, backtracking along the path they had taken the previous evening. If they could reach the horse without being spotted, they might still have a chance to escape to the Shoshone settlement Nathaniel had mentioned. They were within sight of where they had left the horse tethered when disaster struck. A small stone dislodged beneath Adelaide's foot, clattering down the slope with what seemed like thunderous noise in the quiet morning air. "There!" Reuben's voice rang out from somewhere above them. "By the junipers!" Nathaniel grabbed Adelaide's hand, pulling her into a run, just as a rifle shot cracked through the air. The bullet struck stone near her feet, sending fragments flying. "Keep moving," Nathaniel urged, drawing his revolver as they sprinted toward the horse. Another shot, closer this time. Adelaide stumbled but managed to keep her footing. The horse, spooked by the gunfire, was pulling frantically at its tether, eyes rolling in fear. They were still 20 yards from the animal when Hargrove and Reuben appeared on the trail ahead, cutting off their escape route. Clayton limped behind them, his leg roughly bandaged, but his gun hand steady as he aimed at Nathaniel. "That's far enough," Hargrove called, his own pistol leveled at Adelaide. "I admit I'm impressed by your tenacity, Miss Morgan, but this little chase ends now." Nathaniel positioned himself slightly in front of Adelaide, his revolver held low but ready. "Let her go, Hargrove. Whatever quarrel you have is with me." Hargrove's thin smile held no warmth. "On the contrary, Mr. Redfeather, my business is entirely with Miss Morgan, or rather, with what she possesses. You are merely an inconvenience to be eliminated." He gestured to Clayton. "Kill him." Clayton grinned, raising his pistol. Adelaide saw Nathaniel tense, preparing to return fire with the 2 bullets he had left, not enough to take down all 3 men. In that moment of crystal clarity, she knew what would happen. Nathaniel would die trying to protect her, and she would be left at the mercy of a man who had already murdered her brother. "Wait!" she cried, stepping forward. "I'll tell you where the pages are." Hargrove's hand shot up, halting Clayton mid-action. "You have my attention, Miss Morgan." Nathaniel's eyes flicked to her face, a question in their depths. Adelaide gave him the slightest nod, hoping he would understand she was playing for time. "They're not in the book," she said, addressing Hargrove directly. "Daniel was too clever for that. He knew someone might come looking for them." Hargrove lowered his pistol slightly. "Go on." Adelaide took a deep breath, mind racing. "He encoded their location in a letter he sent me the week before the fire, a letter I kept with me when I left Boston." It was a lie, of course, but one Hargrove might believe. Daniel had indeed written to her frequently, discussing his research in the arcane language of scholarly enthusiasm that would be meaningless to anyone outside their field. Hargrove's pale eyes narrowed. "And where is this letter now?" "Hidden." "Oh, hidden," Adelaide replied. "In Sweetwater Junction. I sent it ahead with another passenger from the stagecoach before we were attacked." The plausibility of her story hung in the balance. Adelaide held Hargrove's gaze steadily, willing him to believe her. If he did, it might buy them time. Time for Judge Pierce to realize something was wrong when Nathaniel didn't appear in Lander as promised. "A convenient tale," Hargrove said at last. "One I might be inclined to believe, if not for an interesting discovery we made this morning." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it up for Adelaide to see. Her heart sank. In his hand was a carved wooden eagle, the one Nathaniel had made for her during her fever. "We found this where you were camped several days ago," Hargrove continued. "Curious craftsmanship, and inside—" He twisted the eagle's head, which apparently functioned as a cap, revealing a hollow space within the wooden body. From this space, he extracted a folded piece of yellowed parchment. "Imagine my surprise," Hargrove said softly, "to discover a page from the codex hidden inside a whittled trinket." Adelaide stared at the parchment, genuine confusion flooding through her. She had never seen that page before, had no idea it had been concealed within Nathaniel's carving. She turned to Nathaniel, whose expression had grown completely impassive. You knew? She whispered. Nathaniel's eyes remained fixed on Hargrove. Not until the trading post, he replied quietly. When I heard what the pages contained, I realized what I'd been carrying. How touching, Hargrove interrupted. A partnership of ignorance, but it hardly matters now. He carefully refolded the parchment, returning it to his pocket. I have what I came for. Well, part of it, at least. There were 3 pages torn from the codex, and I intend to recover all 3. He gestured to Clayton and Reuben. Bind them. We'll take them to Sweetwater Junction and see if Miss Morgan's story about a hidden letter proves true. Clayton stepped forward, a length of rope in his hands. Nathaniel tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger of his revolver. I wouldn't, Hargrove warned, his own pistol rising to aim at Adelaide's head. Even if you manage to shoot one of us, the other 2 will ensure Miss Morgan doesn't survive the attempt. For a moment, Adelaide thought Nathaniel would risk it anyway. Then, with evident reluctance, he lowered his weapon. A wise choice, Hargrove said with a thin smile. Now place your revolver on the ground and step away from it. Nathaniel complied, his movements deliberate. Clayton quickly moved in to bind his hands behind his back, taking obvious pleasure in pulling the ropes unnecessarily tight. Reuben did the same to Adelaide, though with noticeably less enthusiasm. As he worked the ropes, his hands trembled slightly. I'm sorry, ma'am, he whispered, so softly only Adelaide could hear. My boy's sick. I never wanted. He fell silent as Clayton glanced their way, his expression hardening into forced indifference. Adelaide caught a glimpse of the conflict in his eyes, a man trapped between desperation and decency. What about his knife? Clayton asked, gesturing to the small blade still sheathed at Nathaniel's hip. Take it, Hargrove ordered. Our friend has demonstrated quite enough creativity with sharp implements. As Clayton removed the knife, his hand lingered on the carved wooden handle. Pretty fancy for an Injun knife, he remarked, testing the edge with his thumb. Careful, Nathaniel said quietly. It's sharp enough to separate a man from his thumb if he's not paying attention. Clayton scowled, roughly shoving the knife into his own belt. You won't be so smug when Hargrove's done with you. With their prisoners secured, Hargrove directed Reuben to retrieve the horse. We'll ride in shifts, he decided. The woman first, as her leg will slow us down otherwise. Clayton can ride once we're closer to Sweetwater. Adelaide was hoisted onto the horse's back, her bound hands making it difficult to maintain her balance. Nathaniel would be forced to walk, his injured arm and bound hands adding to the challenge of the rough terrain. Hargrove took the horse's reins, leading it forward with Adelaide precariously perched in the saddle. As they began their journey toward Sweetwater Junction, now as captives rather than travelers, Adelaide caught Nathaniel's eye. In his steady gaze, she found not defeat but calm determination. Whatever happened, he was not yet ready to surrender. That quiet confidence gave her strength. Hargrove might have the page from the codex, might have them bound and seemingly helpless, but the confrontation was far from over. They traveled for several hours under the increasingly hot Wyoming sun, following the winding river trail toward Sweetwater Junction. Adelaide's discomfort grew with each passing mile. Her injured leg throbbed, the ropes chafed her wrists raw, and the tension of their situation wound her nerves tight as piano wire. Occasionally, she would glance at Nathaniel, walking steadily despite his own injuries and bound hands. His expression revealed nothing to their captors, but Adelaide had begun to recognize the subtle signs of his thoughts, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he assessed their surroundings, the way he measured the distance between each man, the careful attention he paid to the terrain they traversed. He was planning something. The realization both comforted and frightened her. By midday, they had reached a bend in the river where a stand of cottonwoods offered shade from the relentless sun. Hargrove called a halt, instructing Reuben to refill their canteens while Clayton kept watch over the prisoners. Adelaide was allowed to dismount, nearly collapsing as her stiff, injured leg took her weight. Nathaniel moved to help her, but Clayton shoved him back with the barrel of his rifle. Stay where you are, Breed, he growled. She needs water, Nathaniel said calmly, and the bandage on her leg should be changed. Hargrove, who had been consulting a small map, glanced up with mild irritation. Is this true, Miss Morgan? Is your wound troubling you? Adelaide hesitated, uncertain of Nathaniel's intentions but trusting him enough to follow his lead. Yes, she admitted. It's quite painful, and I fear infection might be setting in again. Hargrove considered this, his calculating gaze moving between Adelaide and Nathaniel. Very well, he said at last. Reuben, untie Mr. Redfeather's hands so he may attend to Miss Morgan's injury. But be warned, he added, addressing Nathaniel directly. Any attempt to escape will result in immediate consequences for both of you. Reuben, returning with the filled canteens, reluctantly untied Nathaniel's bonds. As the ropes fell away, Adelaide saw him flex his fingers subtly, restoring circulation to his hands. Under Clayton's watchful eye, Nathaniel knelt beside Adelaide, gently examining her injured leg. The bandage was indeed soiled, spots of fresh blood showing through where the wound had reopened during the morning's exertions. I need clean cloth, Nathaniel said, looking up at Hargrove, and access to my saddlebag for the medicinal herbs. Hargrove nodded to Reuben, who retrieved the saddlebag and dropped it beside Nathaniel. As Nathaniel opened it, Adelaide noticed his movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were performing for their captor's benefit while something else entirely occupied his mind. He produced a small leather pouch of dried herbs and a clean bandage from the bag. With the same careful attention he had shown during their days in the wilderness, he cleaned Adelaide's wound, applied a poultice of crushed herbs, and bound it with fresh cloth. As he worked, he spoke quietly, his voice pitched just loud enough for Adelaide to hear, but not so loud as to raise suspicion from their guards. When we reach Sweetwater Junction, be ready, he murmured, his hands maintaining their steady work on her bandage. Pierce will have men watching for us. Adelaide kept her expression neutral, giving the slightest nod to indicate she understood. Judge Pierce had expected Nathaniel to bring her safely to Sweetwater Junction. When they failed to arrive as anticipated, he might well have sent someone to investigate. What about the page, she whispered back. The one Hargrove found in the carving? Nathaniel's dark eyes flicked briefly to hers. Not the real page, he said, so softly she barely caught the words. A decoy. I carved the eagle hollow, but what Hargrove found was something else entirely. Before Adelaide could ask what he meant, Clayton stomped over, rifle held casually but threateningly. That's enough doctoring, he said. Bind him again, Reuben. Reuben stepped forward with the rope, but Hargrove raised a hand to stop him. A moment, he said, approaching Nathaniel with renewed interest. What did you say about the page, Mr. Redfeather? Nathaniel looked up, his expression impassive. I didn't say anything about a page. Hargrove's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Come now, I distinctly heard you mention the real page and a decoy. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate? Adelaide's heart sank. Hargrove had been watching more carefully than they realized, perhaps even reading their lips during the quiet exchange. Nathaniel rose slowly to his feet, facing Hargrove with calm dignity despite the rifles trained on him. The page you found is worthless, he said plainly. A forgery I created after realizing what you were hunting. Hargrove's face hardened. Impossible. I've studied the codex for years. I would recognize a forgery. Would you? Nathaniel's voice held a note of challenge. The codex was written in medieval Latin with alchemical symbols. How many people in this territory could verify its authenticity? I created it from memory, he continued, using what I know of medieval alchemical texts, the ink mixed from black walnut and iron, aged with coffee and smoke. The parchment treated with animal fat to give it the right texture. But if you look closely, the Latin contains deliberate errors, and the symbolic correspondences are intentionally reversed. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Hargrove's features before he mastered it. He reached into his coat, withdrawing the folded parchment. You expect me to believe you created this? He demanded, unfolding it to reveal elaborate script and intricate diagrams. I expect you to use your eyes, Nathaniel replied calmly. The ink is less than a week old, not centuries. The parchment is new, treated with coffee to appear aged, and the Latin contains deliberate errors no medieval scholar would make. Hargrove stared at the parchment, visibly unsettled for the first time since Adelaide had met him. If this is a forgery, he said slowly, then where is the real page? Safe, Nathaniel said simply, beyond your reach. Rage flashed across Hargrove's face. You test my patience, half-breed, he snarled, the cultured veneer cracking to reveal the ruthless man beneath. Tell me where the real page is, or I'll have Clayton put a bullet in Miss Morgan's unwounded leg. Hargrove's cold eyes flickered to her injured right thigh, then to her left leg. A matching set might make walking difficult. Adelaide tensed, but Nathaniel appeared unmoved by the threat. Kill her, and you'll never find it, he said. The location dies with us. It was a dangerous gamble. Adelaide held her breath, watching the internal struggle play out on Hargrove's face. The desire to lash out in fury, warring with the cold calculation of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through whatever means necessary. Finally, calculation won. Hargrove's expression smoothed, the mask of civility slipping back into place like a well-worn glove. Very well, he said, carefully refolding the parchment and returning it to his pocket. We'll continue to Sweetwater Junction as planned. Perhaps a night of reflection will improve your willingness to cooperate. He nodded to Reuben, who proceeded to bind Nathaniel's hands once more. This time, however, Adelaide noticed that Nathaniel subtly flexed his wrists as the ropes were tightened, creating just enough slack that a determined effort might free him later. Their journey resumed under the hot afternoon sun, the mood considerably darker after the confrontation. Clayton watched Nathaniel with undisguised hatred, while Hargrove had retreated into cold silence, his mind clearly working through the implications of Nathaniel's revelation. Only Reuben seemed affected differently, casting occasional uncertain glances at Adelaide when he thought no one was watching. Once, when Hargrove and Clayton were distracted, he slipped her a water canteen. "I've got a boy," he murmured, "about 7 now. His ma died last winter. This wasn't supposed to be like this." His words trailed off, but the sentiment lingered. A man who had stumbled into villainy rather than chosen it deliberately. There was something in his expression, not quite sympathy, but perhaps the first stirrings of doubt about the enterprise he had joined. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the distinctive structures of Sweetwater Junction appeared on the horizon, a small cluster of wooden buildings nestled in the curve of the river. Under different circumstances, Adelaide might have felt relief at reaching her destination. Now she viewed the approaching settlement with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. If Judge Pierce had indeed sent men to investigate their delay, salvation might await them there. If not, Sweetwater Junction might well become their grave. The settlement grew larger as they approached, details emerging from the distance. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a small church with a modest steeple, what appeared to be a schoolhouse set slightly apart from the other structures. It was to this last building that Adelaide's gaze was drawn, a poignant reminder of the purpose that had brought her west in the first place. Hargrove directed them to skirt the main street, approaching instead from the southern edge where fewer eyes might witness their unusual party. The sun was setting as they reached the outskirts, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. "There," Hargrove said, indicating a small cabin standing alone near a copse of trees. "That appears unoccupied. We'll use it for the night." Clayton was dispatched to investigate the cabin while the others waited in the shelter of the trees. He returned shortly, confirming it was empty and appeared to have been abandoned for some time. "Get them inside," Hargrove ordered, quietly. Adelaide was helped down from the horse, her stiff limbs protesting the movement after hours in the saddle. Nathaniel remained close to her side as they were ushered toward the cabin, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if searching for something or someone. The cabin's interior was sparse, a single room with a rusted stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed frame missing its mattress. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the low ceiling beams. A fitting place, Adelaide thought grimly, for whatever final act Hargrove had planned. "Secure them," Hargrove instructed, gesturing to a support beam in the center of the room. "Then go into town and gather information. I want to know if anyone is asking questions about new arrivals." Reuben and Clayton bound Adelaide and Nathaniel to the beam, back to back, their hands tied together between them. When they had finished, Hargrove dismissed them with instructions to return in an hour. As the door closed behind them, leaving Hargrove alone with his prisoners, an expectant silence filled the cabin. Adelaide could feel Nathaniel's steady presence behind her, his bound hands touching hers in what felt like deliberate reassurance. Hargrove paced slowly before them, removing his hat and placing it carefully on the dusty table. "Now," he said, his voice conversational, as if they were engaged in a pleasant social call, "let's discuss the actual location of the codex pages, shall we?" "There's nothing to discuss," Nathaniel replied evenly. "The page is somewhere you'll never find it." Hargrove's smile was thin. "Everyone breaks eventually, Mr. Redfeather. It's simply a matter of finding the correct pressure point. His gaze shifted to Adelaide. And I believe I've identified yours. He withdrew a small knife from his boot. Not a hunting knife, but a surgeon's scalpel, its blade gleaming wickedly in the fading light through the cabin's single window. I've found that pain is actually quite inefficient as a persuasive tool, Hargrove continued, examining the scalpel with academic interest. It often renders the subject incoherent or unconscious before yielding useful information. Fear, on the other hand, he moved toward Adelaide, the scalpel held casually between his fingers. Tell me, Mr. Redfeather, how much suffering are you willing to watch Miss Morgan endure before you reconsider your position? Adelaide felt Nathaniel's hands tighten against hers. Don't tell him anything, she said quickly. Whatever's in those pages, Daniel died to keep it from him. We can't let that be for nothing. Hargrove's expression hardened. Your brother was a fool, Miss Morgan. He died for knowledge he didn't even understand. Knowledge that could transform the very foundations of modern science if placed in the right hands. Your hands aren't right for anything except destruction, Adelaide retorted, fear giving way to anger. You burned a library, hundreds of irreplaceable books and manuscripts, all for 3 pages of an old text. A necessary sacrifice, Hargrove replied dismissively. You can't create the future without occasionally burning the past. He stepped closer, the scalpel now inches from Adelaide's face. Last chance, Mr. Redfeather. Where is the real page? Adelaide felt rather than heard Nathaniel's deep breath behind her. His fingers moved subtly against hers, an intricate pattern that she suddenly realized was communication. He was spelling something against her palm. Duait. The page is in Lander, Nathaniel said, his voice carefully measured. I sent it to Judge Pierce before we left our first camp. He'll have received it by now. Hargrove's face contorted with fury. You're lying, he hissed. There's been no time for a messenger to reach Lander and return. I didn't say the messenger returned, Nathaniel replied calmly. I found a prospector heading that way, paid him to deliver a package to the judge. By now, Pierce knows exactly what you're after and why you burned the Boston Library. It was a bluff, Adelaide realized. A desperate play to make Hargrove believe the evidence against him was already in official hands, beyond his reach. For a moment, it seemed to work. Hargrove stepped back, calculation replacing rage in his expression as he considered this new complication. Even if that were true, he said finally, it changes nothing. The knowledge in those pages is too valuable to abandon. Once I have all 3, I'll simply disappear. There are places beyond the reach of American law where a man of means can live quite comfortably. He turned the scalpel in his fingers, light catching on its edge. But first, I need to verify your claim. If you've truly sent the page to Pierce, then you can tell me its contents in detail. The formula for transmutation is spread across all 3 pages, with each containing a crucial component. Adelaide felt Nathaniel tense behind her. He had created a convincing forgery, but actually knowing the contents of the real page was another matter entirely. If he couldn't provide a plausible description, Hargrove would know he was lying. The page contains diagrams, Nathaniel began carefully. Concentric circles with alchemical symbols at the cardinal points, Latin text around the outer ring. Hargrove nodded slowly, a predatory gleam entering his eyes. Continue. What symbols? What does the text say? Before Nathaniel could respond, a sharp sound from outside interrupted, the crack of a rifle shot, followed by shouting. Hargrove whirled toward the window, scalpel momentarily forgotten. Clayton, he muttered, moving quickly to peer outside. What has that fool done now? More shouts came from the direction of the town, followed by another gunshot. Hargrove hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining control of his prisoners and investigating the disturbance. Don't move, he ordered, pointing the scalpel at them in warning before striding to the door. He paused there, listening intently, then slipped outside. The moment the door closed, Nathaniel's fingers began working frantically at the ropes binding their hands. Can you reach the knot? Adelaide whispered. Almost, Nathaniel replied, his voice strained with effort. When Reuben tied me earlier, I created some slack. If I can just... She felt the ropes loosen slightly, then more as Nathaniel managed to work one hand partially free. Outside, the commotion continued. More shouts, The sound of running feet, another gunshot. "What's happening out there?" Adelaide asked. "Not sure," Nathaniel said, still working at the ropes. "Could be Pierce's men. Could be something else entirely." With a final effort, his hand came free. "Got it." He made quick work of the remaining bonds, freeing both of them from the support beam. As Adelaide rubbed circulation back into her wrists, Nathaniel moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. "Something's happening in town," he reported. "A group of riders. Looks like they're surrounding the main street." "Pierce?" Adelaide asked hopefully. "Maybe." Nathaniel turned back to her, his expression grave. "But Hargrove will be back soon, with or without Clayton and Reuben. We need to move now." He helped Adelaide to her feet, supporting her as she tested her injured leg. It held, though pain shot through it with each step. "Head for the trees behind the cabin," Nathaniel instructed. "Stay low and move as quietly as you can." "What about you?" Nathaniel's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I need to recover something first." "I'll be right behind you." Adelaide wanted to protest, to insist they stay together, but the urgency in his voice brooked no argument. With a reluctant nod, she moved toward the cabin's rear door, which opened onto a small, cleared area backing onto the copse of trees Hargrove had noted earlier. The evening air was cool against her face as she slipped outside, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. Keeping low, Adelaide made her way across the cleared ground as quickly as her injured leg would allow, the cover of the trees seeming impossibly distant. She had nearly reached the first line of trees when a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking her path. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought Hargrove had circled around the cabin to cut off their escape. Then the figure spoke, and relief flooded through her. "Miss Morgan, I presume?" The voice belonged to an older man, his face weathered by years under the western sun. He wore no badge, but the authority in his bearing suggested law enforcement. "Judge Pierce sent me to find you and Red Feather. Where is he?" "We've been tracking you since yesterday," the deputy continued, his voice low. "Found Red Feather's markers along the river, then spotted the commotion at the trading post. Been watching Hargrove and his men since they brought you into town. Pierce has deputies positioned throughout Sweetwater Junction, waiting for our signal." "In the cabin," Adelaide replied, glancing back anxiously. "There's a man, Hargrove. He's dangerous. He killed my brother, burned down the Boston Library." The deputy nodded grimly. "We know. Pierce received a message this morning, a package delivered by a prospector passing through Lander. Contains some old parchment and a letter explaining the situation." Adelaide stared at him in shock. Nathaniel's bluff hadn't been a bluff at all. He had actually sent the page to Pierce, exactly as he'd claimed. Before she could process this revelation, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cabin, the crash of breaking glass followed by angry shouting in Hargrove's voice. The deputy pushed Adelaide behind him, drawing his revolver and advancing toward the cabin. "Stay here," he ordered. "My men have the town secured. Clayton and the other one are already in custody." Adelaide watched as the deputy approached the cabin cautiously, joined by two other armed men emerging from the trees. They converged on the building from different angles, weapons ready. Then the cabin door burst open, and two figures erupted into the twilight. Nathaniel and Hargrove locked in desperate struggle. Hargrove's scalpel flashed in the fading light, seeking vulnerable flesh. Nathaniel blocked the thrust with his forearm, blood already staining his shirt sleeve where the blade had found its mark. "Drop your weapon," the deputy shouted, aiming his revolver at the grappling pair. Hargrove, seeing himself surrounded, fought with the frenzy of a cornered animal. With sudden, vicious strength, he broke free of Nathaniel's grip and lunged, not at his opponent but toward Adelaide, the scalpel extended before him like a talisman of death. Time seemed to slow. Adelaide saw the blade approaching, knew she couldn't move quickly enough to avoid it. Behind Hargrove, Nathaniel's expression transformed from determination to raw fear as he realized what was happening. In that suspended moment, Adelaide closed her eyes, a strange peace descending as she prepared to meet the fate that had claimed her brother 3 years earlier. The impact never came. Instead, a different sound reached her ears, the solid thunk of something striking flesh, followed by Hargrove's choked gasp. Adelaide opened her eyes to find him frozen mid-stride, a small wooden handle protruding from his shoulder. Nathaniel's carved knife, thrown with deadly accuracy. Hargrove staggered, the scalpel falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The deputy and his men were on him instantly, forcing him to the ground and securing his hands behind his back. Nathaniel reached Adelaide's side, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, words momentarily beyond her. The realization of how close death had come left her trembling, adrenaline draining away to leave exhausted relief in its wake. "It's over," Nathaniel said quietly, supporting her with a steady arm around her waist. "Pierce got the page and my letter. He knows everything." Adelaide leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "You actually sent it," she murmured. "I thought you were bluffing." A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. Sometimes the truth is the best strategy. As the deputies led a subdued Hargrove away, Judge Pierce himself approached from the direction of the town, his tall figure unmistakable, even in the gathering darkness. He nodded a greeting to Nathaniel before turning his attention to Adelaide. "When you two didn't arrive in Sweetwater yesterday as arranged, I sent men to search along your likely routes. Fortunately, Red Feather's woodland signs were clear to those who know how to read them. We've had this cabin under observation since you were brought here, just waiting for the right moment to act. Hargrove was too dangerous to approach directly without ensuring your safety first." "Miss Morgan," he said, removing his hat respectfully, "I'm relieved to find you alive, if somewhat worse for wear. Red Feather's message reached me this morning, quite a tale it told." Adelaide straightened, finding her voice again. "It's all true, Your Honor. Hargrove burned the Boston Library to steal the Codex Philosophorum. He killed my brother and others in the process." Pierce nodded gravely. "So Red Feather's letter indicated. The Shoshone trader delivered the package to my office 3 days ago. The page wrapped in waxed leather, along with a detailed account of your situation. I dispatched deputies immediately." Pierce shook his head slightly. The page itself was illuminating, to say the least. "I've never seen anything quite like it." "The second page was with you all along?" Adelaide asked, turning to Nathaniel. He nodded. "And the third is still hidden." Daniel was more clever than Hargrove gave him credit for. He didn't hide all the pages in one place. "What will happen to Hargrove?" Adelaide asked. "He'll stand trial for murder and arson in Boston," Pierce replied. "The evidence is substantial. Your testimony, Red Feather's, and the page itself. I suspect he'll hang for what he's done." The judge turned to Nathaniel, his expression softening slightly. "As for you, Red Feather, it seems I owe you an apology. When we last met, I believed you a vigilante, taking the law into your own hands. Now I find you protecting it at considerable personal risk." Nathaniel inclined his head but said nothing, his face unreadable in the dim light. "The matter of the 3 men in Montana remains," Pierce continued. "But given the circumstances and your service in this affair, I'm inclined to view it with leniency. There will be no further pursuit of that matter from my office." It was as close to a pardon as Nathaniel was likely to receive, Adelaide realized. The judge was offering him a clean slate, a rare gift in a territory where justice often came from the barrel of a gun rather than a courtroom. "Thank you, Your Honor," Nathaniel said quietly. Pierce nodded, replacing his hat. "The schoolhouse is prepared for Miss Morgan's arrival," he said, changing the subject. "Though perhaps a visit to our local doctor is in order first, for both of you." With that, he turned and walked back toward the town, leaving Adelaide and Nathaniel alone in the deepening twilight. "So," Adelaide said after a moment, "it truly is over." Nathaniel's gaze followed the judge's retreating figure. "The danger, yes, but something tells me your story in Sweetwater Junction is just beginning." Adelaide looked toward the small settlement, where lamplight now glowed in windows and smoke rose from chimneys against the darkening sky. Somewhere among those buildings was the schoolhouse where she would teach, perhaps even create the library she had dreamed of establishing. "Our story," she corrected softly, turning back to Nathaniel, "if you choose to stay." Something shifted in his dark eyes, uncertainty giving way to consideration. "Sweetwater Junction might not welcome someone like me," he said, echoing his earlier concern. "They'll welcome the man who helped bring a murderer to justice," Adelaide replied. "The man whose knowledge bridges 2 worlds. The man who saved the new school teacher's life." She reached for his hand, her fingers finding his with newfound certainty. "Stay, Nathaniel, at least for a while." He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, a slow smile transforming his solemn features. For a while, he agreed. Together they walked toward Sweetwater Junction, toward lamplight and civilization, toward a future neither had imagined when their paths first crossed in the wilderness. 2 weeks later, Adelaide stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, watching as children filed in for the morning lesson. Her leg had healed well under the care of the local doctor, leaving only a slight stiffness that would likely fade with time. The physical wound, like the emotional ones from Boston, was healing slowly but surely. Inside the classroom, fresh scrubbed faces looked expectantly toward the chalkboard where she had written out the day's lessons. Among them, in the back row, sat a thin boy with serious eyes. Reuben's son, sent to school as part of his father's attempt at redemption. Reuben himself had received a reduced sentence after testifying against Hargrove. His cooperation and evident remorse earning him a chance to rebuild his life once his prison term was served. Clayton had not been so fortunate, facing multiple charges of attempted murder and kidnapping. Hargrove was already on his way east, heavily guarded, to stand trial in Boston. The pages from the codex, all three of them, recovered from various hiding places with Nathaniel's help, were sealed in a diplomatic pouch, bound for Washington, where government scientists would study their contents under strict supervision. Maxwell Garrett stood at the gate, leaning on his cane, a satchel of books under his arm. Since testifying against Hargrove, he'd taken rooms above the general store, volunteering his time to help establish Sweetwater Junction's first proper library. "Morning delivery, Miss Morgan," he called, holding up the satchel. "Some primer texts from Denver." His presence was another unexpected gift from her journey, a connection to Daniel and a bridge between her past and future. Adelaide turned at the sound of footsteps approaching the schoolhouse. Nathaniel walked up the path, carrying a wooden crate filled with books, donations from various townspeople for the school library Adelaide had begun to establish. "More treasures for your collection," he said, setting the crate down on the porch. Mrs. Peterson had these in her attic, classics mostly. She thought the children might enjoy them. Adelaide smiled, running her hand along the spine of a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. "They're perfect. Thank you for collecting them." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze moving to the distant mountains visible beyond the settlement. In the 2 weeks since their arrival in Sweetwater Junction, he had found an uneasy but growing acceptance among the townspeople. His skills as a healer had proven valuable when the blacksmith's son broke his arm, and his knowledge of the surrounding territory made him a natural liaison with the neighboring Shoshone. Still, Adelaide sensed his restlessness at times, the call of open spaces and solitude that had been his companions for so long. "Will you stay for the reading this afternoon?" she asked. "The children enjoyed your story yesterday." A small smile touched his lips. "Perhaps. I need to check on the Wilson's mare first. She's due to foal any day now." He turned to go, but Adelaide caught his hand, stopping him. "I have something for you," she said. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object, a carved wooden eagle, similar to the one that had contained the forged page, but new and freshly made by her own inexpert hands. "It's not as skilled as yours," she admitted, placing it in his palm, "but I wanted to try. The crow believed that when you create something, you put a piece of your spirit into it. Isn't that right?" Nathaniel stared at the carving, his expression softening in a way that transformed his entire face. He closed his fingers gently around the wooden bird. "Thank you," he said quietly. Adelaide nodded, suddenly shy. "I've been practicing. There's a lot of wood in Wyoming, after all." Nathaniel smiled fully then, a rare and transformative sight. "There's a lot of everything in Wyoming," and he agreed. "Space, time, possibility." He pocketed the eagle carefully, his dark eyes meeting hers with a warmth that hadn't been there when they first met in the wilderness. "I'll see you this afternoon," he promised, then turned and walked away toward the stables, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning sun. Adelaide watched him go, a contentment settling over her that she hadn't felt since before the fire that had claimed Daniel and set her on this unexpected path. Her brother was gone, but his legacy lived on, not just in the rescued pages of the Codex, but in the knowledge he had valued so highly, the pursuit of truth that had defined his life. Turning back to the schoolhouse, Adelaide ran her hand along the rough-hewn doorframe. At its edge, nearly invisible unless one knew to look, was a small carving, a tiny owl, symbol of wisdom, cut into the wood by Nathaniel's skilled hands. It was a beginning. This school, this town, this new chapter. A story being carved, day by day, into the fabric of a vast and promising land. Adelaide Morgan smiled and stepped inside to teach. As the schoolroom door closed behind her, she felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since before the Boston fire. The journey from that burning library to this frontier schoolhouse had been marked by pain, danger, and unexpected grace. Daniel would have appreciated the symmetry. Knowledge destroyed in flames, now reborn in this humble wooden building on the edge of civilization. Outside, through the window, she could see Nathaniel pausing at the edge of town, looking back. His silhouette against the morning sun reminded her of that first day when he had appeared like a shadow against the merciless Wyoming sky. They had both been broken then, she by guilt, he by belonging nowhere. Now they were finding their place, carving something new from the raw materials of their fractured pasts. In the distance, the Wind River Mountains stood unchanging, witnesses to countless human dramas played out beneath their ancient peaks. Adelaide touched the small wooden eagle in her pocket, a reminder that sometimes one must soar above pain to see the broader landscape of possibility. "Now, children," she said, turning to the eager faces before her, "today we begin our journey through words.